Hello, it's Mrs. Tayo, City of Ember. I'm going to read you guys chapter 15. Previously on the City of Ember in chapter 14, Lena and Dune were still trying to figure out part of the instructions, and they found out that there was a way out of Ember, and it was the river, and there was a boat that they were going to ride on to get out of Ember. And the last paragraph of chapter 14 says, they stared at each other in the flickering light, realizing what this meant. There was no tunnel leading out of Ember. The way out was the river. To leave Ember, they must go out on the river. So we'll see what happens. Chapter 15 is called A Desperate Run. But this can't be right, said Dune. If the river is the only way out of Ember, why is there just one boat? It's only big enough for 2 people. I don't know, said Lena. It is strange. Let's look around some more. They stood up. Dune went back to where they had left the boxes and got another candle. He brought it into the boat room and lit it, and the room grew twice as bright. Right away they saw what they hadn't noticed before. In the back wall was a door almost as wide as the whole room. When they went up to it, they could see that it too was a sliding door. Dune pulled the hold of the handle and was on the right and pulled sideways, and the door rolled smoothly open to reveal more darkness. They stepped in. They could guess from the echoing sound of their voices when they spoke that they were in a tremendous room. Though the ceiling was low, they could see it just over their heads. The candlelight glinted off something shiny, and as they went in farther, they could see that the room was filled with boats, row upon row upon row of them, just like the one in the first room. There must be hundreds, Lena whispered. Enough for everyone, I suppose, said Dune. They wandered around a bit, but there wasn't really much to see. All the boats were the same. Each one contained 2 metal boxes and 2 paddles. The room was cold, and the air felt heavy in their lungs. The candle flames burned weakly, so they went back to the small room and slid the door closed behind them. I guess, said Lena, that this first boat is meant as a sort of sample. We learn what's what on the ones that has signs. Boat, paddles, candle, matches. They went back out to the river's edge. Lena blew out her candle and began closing up the boxes they'd opened. Dune blew out his too. I'm going to take my candle with me, he said, to look at later. I want some matches as well. He took a packet of matches from the box and tucked it inside his shirt. Lena returned the boxes to the boat room and slid the door closed. Then she and Dune stood together on the ledge and gazed down. Less than a foot below, the river rushed by. A short distance downstream, it plunged into the dark mouth in the wall and disappeared. Well, he said, we've found it. We've found it, Lena repeated wonderingly. And tomorrow, at the start of the singing, said Dune, we'll stand up in Harkin Square and tell the whole city. This is so Dune to want to tell the entire city what he's found and expose everyone. That's just so totally Dune. Remember, we know our characters really well. I could have predicted that Dune would want to do that. When they came up out of the pipeworks, it was nearly 6 o'clock. They hadn't realized they had been down there so long. Both Dune's father and Mrs. Murdo would be wondering where they were. They stood for a moment under a lamppost, just long enough to agree on a time to meet the next day and plan their announcement. Then they hurried home. When Dune's father asked why he was so late, he said his song rehearsal had gone long. He wanted to shout out to his father, "We've found the way out! We're saved!" But he held himself in for the sake of his moment of glory. Tomorrow, when his father saw him on the steps of the gathering hall, he would be so overcome with surprise and pride that he would go weak in the knees. And all the people standing next to him would have to catch him and hold him up. And the announcement about the thieving mayor, that would probably happen tomorrow, too. Dune had almost forgotten in the excitement of finding the boats, the mayor's arrest and the city's rescue, both at once. It was going to be an amazing day. Racing thoughts kept Dune awake almost until morning. The day of the singing was a holiday for the entire city. All the stores and other businesses were closed. This meant that Dune didn't have to go to the pipeworks. His father didn't have to go to his shop either, but he was going to go anyhow. If he wasn't in his shop fussing with his merchandise, he didn't know what to do with himself. Dune dawdled over his breakfast of carrot sticks and mashed turnips, waiting for his father to go. He wanted to get ready for the journey down the river. They probably wouldn't leave for a few days, and he and Lena would make their announcement tonight, and people would need time to get organized before they could leave the city, but he was too excited to sit around doing nothing. So Dune has this plan, and Lena has this plan. What are you guys thinking about this plan? Do you think, knowing this author and knowing this story, that the plan is going to be carried out in the way that Dune and Lena are thinking? I'm not so sure. Let's see. As soon as his father left, Dune slipped the case off of his pillow. This would be his traveling pack. He put in the candle and the matches. He put the key he had borrowed from the pipeworks office. He put it in a good-sized piece of rope that he'd found at the trash heaps that he'd been saving for years, and a bottle of water. He put in an ancient folding knife that his father had given him, which had come down through generations of his family, and which he used to chop off his bangs when they got so long they tickled his eyelids. That's what Harrison's bangs look like now. He put in some extra clothes in case he got wet, and some paper and a pencil so that he could write a record of the journey. Along with these things, he crammed a small blanket. It might be cold in the new city, and a packet of food, 6 carrots, a handful of vitamins, some peas and mushrooms wrapped in a lettuce leaf, 2 boiled beets, and 2 boiled turnips. How's that sound? That should be enough. Surely when they got to where they were going, the people who lived there would give them something to eat. He tied the top of the pillowcase in a knot, and then he untied it again. He might want to add something else. So Dune is thinking they're definitely going to a destination with other people, that when they find their way out of the Ember, they're going to find other cities and other places. He stood in the middle of the apartment and looked around at the jumble of stuff. There was nothing else here that he wanted to take with him. Nope, there was one thing. He went back into his room. From beneath his bed, he pulled out the pages of his bug book. He leafed through it. The white spider. The moth with the zigzag pattern on its wings. That bee, striped brown and yellow on its rear end. He looked at his drawings for a long time, memorizing their beauty and strangeness. Tiny fringes of hair, minute claws, jointed legs. Should he take this with him? There might not be creatures like this where they were going. He might never ever see such things again. But no, he'd leave it behind. The pack should be small and light. He put the bug book back under his bed and pulled out the box where he kept the green worm. He drew back the scarf to check his captive one more time. Several days before, the worm had done a curious thing. It had wrapped himself up in a blanket of threads. Since then, it had hung motionless from a bit of cabbage stem. What are you thinking the worm actually is? If it wrapped itself up in a blanket of threads and hung motionless from a bit of cabbage stem, I don't think Dune has a worm. Dune had been watching it carefully. Either it was dead or it was undergoing the change he'd read about in a library book, but he could hardly believe was true. The change from a crawling thing to a flying thing. So far, the bundled up worm had shown no signs of life. But now he saw that it was wriggling. The whole wrapped up bundle, which was shaped like a large vitamin pill, bent slightly from side to side, then was still, then bent back and forth again. Something was pushing at the top end of it, and in a moment, the threads were split apart and a dark furry knob emerged. Dune watched, holding his breath. Next came 2 hair-like legs, which clawed and plucked at the blanket. In a few minutes, the whole creature was out. Egress, thought Dune with a smile. The creature's wings were crushed flat against its body at first, but soon they opened, and Dune saw what his green worm had become, a moth with light brown wings. He lifted the box and carried it to the window. He opened the window and held the box into the air. The moth waved its feathery feelers and took a few steps along the wilted cabbage leaf. For several minutes, it stood still, its wings trembling slightly. Then it fluttered up into the air, rising higher and higher until it was just a pale spot in the dark sky. Dune watched until the moth disappeared. He knew he had seen something marvelous. What was the power that turned the worm into a moth? It was greater than any power the builders had had. He was sure of it. The power that ran the city of Ember was feeble by comparison and about to run out. For a few minutes he stood by the window, looking out over the square and thinking again about what to pack for his journey. Should he put in anything like nails or wire? Would he need money? Should he take some soap? Then he laughed and struck a hand against his head. He kept forgetting that the entire population of the city would be with him on the trip. If he needed something he didn't have, someone would surely be able to supply it. So he tied a knot in his pillowcase and was about to close the window when he caught sight of 3 burly men wearing the red and brown uniform of the city guards striding into the square. They stopped and looked around for a moment. Then one of them confronted old humpbacked Nammy Proggs, who was standing not far from the entrance to the small items shop. The guard towered over her, and she twisted her head sideways and squinted up at him. Dune could hear the guard's voice clearly. "We're looking for a boy named Harrow." "Why?" said Nammy. "Spreading vicious rumors," was the answer. "Do you know where he is?" Nammy hesitated a moment, and then she said, "Went off to the trash heaps just a minute ago." The guard nodded curtly and beckoned to his companions. They marched away. Spreading vicious rumors? Doon was so stunned that he stood still as stone for a long minute. What could they possibly mean? There was only one answer. It had to be what they had told the assistant guard about the mayor. Why were they calling it a vicious rumor? It was the truth. He didn't understand it. He did understand, though, that Nammy Proggs had done him a favor. She must have seen that the guards meant him no good. She had protected him, at least for the moment, by sending the guards to the wrong place. Doon forced his mind to slow down and think. Why did the guards think he and Lena were lying? Obviously, they hadn't investigated the room in Tunnel 351. If they had known he and Lena were telling the truth. He could think of only one other possibility. What do you think the possibility is? I'm thinking the guards, at least some of them, already knew what the mayor was doing. They knew about it and wanted it to stay a secret. And why? It was clear. The guards, too, were getting things from the storerooms. It had to be the answer. For a moment, the fear he'd felt when he saw the guards was replaced by rage. The familiar hot wave rose in him, and he wanted to grab a handful of his father's nails or pot shards and throw them against the wall. But all at once he remembered, if the guards were after him, they'd be after Lena too. He had to warn her. He dashed down the stairs, his anger turning into power for his running feet. All right, we're going to do a scene change over to Lena now. After discovering the room full of boats, Lena had come to Mrs. Murdo's with the sound of the river still in her ears. It was like a huge, powerful voice, roaring at the top of its lungs. Deep inside herself, Lena felt an answering call, as if she, too, contained a drop of the same power. She would ride on the river, and she could hardly believe it, and it might take her to the shining city she had dreamed of, or it might drown her. What she had imagined before, the smooth, gently sloping path leading out, now seemed childish. How could the way into a new world be so easy? She dreaded going on the river, but she was ready for it too. She longed to go. She slept that night in the beautiful blue-green room, in the big lumpy bed with Poppy next to her. She felt safe here. Mrs. Murdo came in and tucked the covers around her. She sat on the edge of the bed and sang an odd little song to Poppy. Something about rock-a-bye baby in the treetops. What are treetops? Lena asked, but Mrs. Murdo didn't know. It's a very old song. It's probably nonsense words. She said goodnight and went out into the living room where Lena could hear her humming quietly as she tidied up. She was so orderly. She never left her stockings draped over the back of a chair or her sewing spread out all over the table. Lena closed her eyes and waited for sleep. But her thoughts kept tumbling around. So much was going to happen tomorrow. The whole city would be in an uproar. People would stream down into the pipeworks to see the boats. They'd be excited, shouting and laughing and crying, packing up their belongings and surging into the streets. If they couldn't all fit into the boats, there would be fights. Some people might get hurt. It was going to be a mess. She'd have to keep her little family close around her. Poppy, Mrs. Murdo, and Doon, and perhaps Doon's father and Clary. Through it all, she would hold tight to Poppy so no harm would come to her. It seemed she had barely closed her eyes when she felt Poppy's hard little heels banging against her shins. "Time to get up, get up, get up," Poppy chirped. She got out of bed and dressed herself and Poppy. In the kitchen, Mrs. Murdo had mashing potatoes for breakfast. How lovely, Lena thought, to have breakfast cooked for her, to hear water bubbling in the pot, and to find a bowl and a spoon set out on the table and vitamins lined up neatly beside a cup of beet tea. I could live here forever, Lena thought, before she remembered that in a day or two they would all be leaving. There was a sudden banging on the front door. Who do you think it is? Mrs. Murdo dried her hands and went to answer it, but before she'd taken 3 steps, the banging came again. I'm coming, Mrs. Murdo cried, and when she opened the door, there was Doon. His face was flushed and he was breathing hard. He had a bulging pillowcase slung over his shoulder. He looked past Mrs. Murdo to Lena. I have to talk to you, he said, right now, but... He threw a doubtful glance at Mrs. Murdo. Lena scrambled up from the table. I'm here, she said, towing him across the blue-green room. When she had closed the door, Doon told her what had happened. They'll come for you too, he said, any minute. We have to get out of here. We have to hide from them. Lena could hardly make sense of what he was saying. They were in trouble? Her legs went shaky at the knees. Hide, she said. Hide where? We could go to the school. No one would be there today, or the library. It's almost always open, even on holidays. He hopped impatiently from foot to foot. But we have to go fast. We have to go now. They have signs up about us all over the city. Signs? Telling people to report if they see us. Lena felt as if a swarm of insects was inside her head, buzzing so loudly she couldn't think. How long do we have to hide? All day? I don't know. We don't have time to think about it. Lena, they could be outside the door this minute. The urgency in his voice convinced her. On the way through the living room, she gave Poppy a quick kiss and called, "Bye, Mrs. Murdo. We have some emergency work to do. If anyone comes asking for me, say I'll be back later." They were down the stairs before Mrs. Murdo could ask any questions. Once in the street, they ran. "Where to?" Lena said. "The school," Dune answered. They took Greystone Street, staying within the shadows as much as they could. As they passed the shoe shop, Lena saw a white piece of paper stuck up on the window. She glanced at it and it gave her heart a wild jump. Her name and Dune's name were written on it in big black letters. I'll show you the sign. It says, Dune Harrow and Lena Mayfleet, wanted for spreading vicious rumors. If you see them, report to Mayor's chief guard. Believe nothing they say. Reward. Uh-oh. She snatched the poster off the window, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the nearest trash can. In the next block, she tore down 2 more, and Dune ripped one off a lamppost. But there were too many to get them all, and they didn't have time to waste. They ran faster. On this holiday, people slept late, and because the stores were closed, the streets were nearly empty. Still, they took the long route all the way out by the beehives to avoid Spark Swallow Square, where a few people might be standing around and talking. They ran past the greenhouses and up Deadlock Street. As they crossed Night Street, Lena glanced to her left. 2 blocks away, a couple of guards were crossing to Greengate Square. She tapped Dune's shoulder and pointed. He saw, and they ran faster. Had they been noticed? Lena thought not. They would have heard a shout if the guards had seen them. They went to the school and went in through the back door. In the wide hallway, their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. It was strange to be here again, and to be here alone, without the clatter and chatter of other children. The hallway with its 8 doors seemed smaller to Lena than it had when she was a student, and shabbier. The planks of the floor were scruffed gray, and there was a cloud of finger smudges around the doorknob of each door. They went into Mrs. Thorne's room, and out of habit, sat at their old desks. "I don't think they'll look for us here," said Dune. "If they do, we can crawl into the paper cabinet." He set his pack down next to him on the floor. For a while they just sat there, getting their breath back. They hadn't turned the light on, so the room was dim. The only light came from beneath the blind over the window. "Those posters," Lena said after a while. "Yes, everyone will see them. What will they do if they catch us?" "I don't know. Something to keep us from telling what we know. Put us in the prison room, maybe." Lena ran her finger